Oh, terror incarnate! There is life in me yet! I will soon feast upon your heart! Mark my words! You too shall know fear!
Shadow of the Erdtree, the DLC for the extremely popular and critically adored Elden Ring, released a little while back, and the world at large had the same discussion it always does when From Software releases anything new. We all gathered around our computers and once again asked the age-old question, has Miyazaki gone too far this time? Well, it turns out quite a large number of people answered this question with yes. Within about a day of Shadow of the Erdtree releasing, it received an overall mixed review score on Steam. This has since improved, and plenty of those negative reviews were due to the reportedly awful PC performance, but there was also a noticeably large and extremely vocal presence of players that seemed fixated on this DLC's supposed extreme difficulty. And of course, I can sympathize, even as someone that would probably be considered a Souls veteran. Sometimes I find myself feeling like From's boss fights can be extremely daunting, whether it be because they have an overwhelming moveset or maybe they just have some janky hitboxes, but generally I've always been able to squeeze by. So then, what's all the discourse about? Are these gamers having a skill issue? Have they simply become complacent in the 2 years since Elden Ring came out? Have they begun to drink water instead of Red 40? Or are we perhaps missing something by focusing so intensely on this question of difficulty? Well, I'm about to spend way too long talking about it, so who's to say? I finally get to make one of these. Let's do it, baby! If you're familiar with these games at all, you're probably also familiar with the culture that surrounds them. Gamers take this shit seriously. There's still many today that'll tell you that in order to play From Software's games at all, you've got to be ready to push yourself. You've got to be willing to give yourself gray hairs from stress as you die over and over until you learn how to survive in this cruel, cruel world. So, if this is still the same series of games we're talking about, then how did we get here? Well, we're gonna have to start at the beginning. Released in June of 2008, Metal Gear Online 2 was a bespoke multiplayer mode that came packaged with Metal Gear Solid 4 on the PlayStation 3. MGO2 was unique for all sorts of reasons, but it was particularly unique in this case for being one of the only console shooters around this time to support keyboard input and feature a full in-game chat. So it was pretty common for players to plug a keyboard into their PS3 and talk mad shit at each other during their matches. Unsurprisingly, a distinctly toxic and elitist sort of community formed around this game, with a lot of new phrases and terms cropping up specifically from MGO2. The most era-defining phrase, let's say, to come from this community that we all know and love was, of course, "get good." A little later, in early 2009, a game had just been released overseas on the very same console by the name of Demon's Souls. Being that the PS3 was a region-free console, a rather sizable group of MGO2 players all decided to get their hands on the imported version of the game and began playing it together rather obsessively, many months before the game would ever see its official release in the US. You see, Demon's Souls wasn't a single-player game. It was very much intended to be played with a large online multiplayer presence, and it was critically praised by quite a few outlets for this very aspect. This took form in things like bloodstains, which lets you see exactly how a player who previously ventured through the same area died, messages, which allowed players to have an asynchronous form of communication with others, world tendency, which you're better off just watching an entire separate video about, invasions, where you invade another player's game as a Black Phantom with the sole purpose of ruining their day, or cooperation, where you'd be summoned as a Blue Phantom to come to another player's aid. By the time we got the game here in the States, the import players had been practicing Demon's Souls for nearly a year, making it especially difficult for anyone who had just picked the game up to come anywhere near their level of skill. As any well-adjusted individual might do, these players quickly took to forums and message boards to tell all the new Demon's Souls players that if they were dying a lot in this game, especially to the bosses or Black Phantoms, they simply needed to get good, or in other words, emulate the way that they were playing the game instead of whatever they were doing before. Demon's Souls wasn't exactly what you'd call mega popular. It reportedly sold under 1 million copies, and even Shuhei Yoshida later admitted he didn't believe in the project, calling it, quote,
crap! This is an unbelievably bad game!
But Demon's Souls had very dedicated fans, and that fan base was ravenous for more. Fast forward a few years, and the spiritual successor, Dark Souls, is slated for release in 2011. Bandai Namco of America did what Americans do best, though, and they marketed it like this. This is Brian Hong. Brian was the senior brand manager at Bandai Namco of America who ran the marketing campaign for Dark Souls.
Well, you guys have probably already heard or read out of Japan that they wanted to make this game harder, and believe us, it is definitely going to be harder, but just like Demon's Souls was. It's not a stupid hard, it's not an unfair hard, but this game is definitely going to kick your ass.
When Dark Souls sold over 3 times as many copies as Demon's Souls, about half of that being from just the US alone, Bandai Namco was extremely happy and must have given at least some of the credit of its success to Brian, because they promoted him to Director of Marketing the following year.
You know, I'll share a story about Dark Souls. It was one of the first games that they gave me to work on when I got to this company. All I kept seeing was how hard this game was, and a lot of people said, don't talk about how hard it is because people won't want it.
This marketing campaign, combined with the now even larger amount of fans taking their turn to tell all the newbies they should get good, wasn't exactly a unique environment for online games around this time.
Oh, Riot Shield! I'm a pussy that use Riot Shield!
But it undoubtedly laid a foundation in the surrounding culture that we're still feeling the repercussions of to this day.
I absolutely suck at video games, so my approach or playstyle was to use everything I have at my disposal. All the assistance, every scrap of aid that the game offers, and also all of the knowledge that I have as the architect of the game. I might be the one who's benefiting the most from that as a player more than anyone else.
Many of the criticisms I've seen levied towards Shadow of the Erdtree in particular, outside of supposedly having overtuned bosses, is that players found the rewards of exploring the DLC's map to be underwhelming and disappointing. Another cookbook here, another smithing stone here, another spirit ash upgrade there. YouTube channel Feeble King makes pretty much this exact point in their critique video for the DLC.
Outside of Shadow Realm blessings, a few new talismans, and if you decide to build switch to a new weapon, all extrinsic rewards in the DLC are worthless. Now whenever I explore and see a purple item, I'm always thinking, please be the only important item in the game, and then I'm sorely disappointed when it's just another cookbook and I wasted my time.
This complaint makes sense on its surface. In a game where it's possible to find some really cool rewards, it makes sense out of any sort of broader context why these things would be underwhelming to find instead. But I couldn't help but notice while watching this video that nearly every time time I can see their equipped items, there's never anything in their left-hand slot, definitely nothing in their spell slot, and the only consumables they ever have equipped are healing flasks and wondrous physic. This sort of begs the question, aren't those things you found only disappointing if you're a player that doesn't use consumables, doesn't want to experiment with new weapons, and refuses to use Spirit Ash summons?
Revered Spirit Ash is largely useless for someone like me who doesn't use summons.
Coincidentally, they, like many others, felt that the DLC was simply too difficult in a way that they didn't enjoy.
FromSoft has completely lost the plot. It's no longer about making a fun game for the majority of players that is also hard. There's this Souls-like cycle where a new game comes out, people rage about the difficulty, and then a few years later, people say it was never all that hard and you just had to adapt. I firmly believe that Elden Ring DLC has broken the cycle. This game will always be seen as hard.
Sorry, this clip in particular is so fucking funny because acknowledging that there's a cycle that keeps repeating but insisting you're not part of it is like such a From Software character thing to do. Last Protagonist, a channel who I very much respect and whose work has been invaluable when it comes to the lore and translation nuances of these games, for some reason decided to play the entire DLC without using the central upgrade item, Shadow Tree Fragments.
I didn't want to have another experience where I completely outscaled the enemies in the DLC by exploring too much, so I chose not to use the Shadow Tree Blessings. This did indeed make the bosses hit harder and have more inflated pools of health, but the core movesets would be the same, which is what I'd ultimately be judging.
By the way, just to give some context, Shadow Tree Blessings give your character a flat stat increase while you're in the DLC, and during the week of its release, so many people either had tutorials manually turned off or skipped the tutorial about them that whoever runs the official Bandai Namco US Twitter account felt it necessary to tell people to start fucking using them. You can tell they clearly understand they've made a pretty bizarre choice by doing this because they felt the need to reiterate that they don't regret it about 3 times.
But I stand by my decision. I don't regret this decision at all, but I don't regret my decision since I got to judge each boss on equal footing.
Curiously, they also go out of their way to do something I see confusingly often when people talk about these games, which is to describe the boss fights by using the term neutral.
But so many bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree have such extreme gap closers, it simply isn't feasible to hang back and rebuff or use flasks while you and the boss are in neutral.
A word that most commonly is used in the fighting game community, typically to refer to a player versus player situation where no one has an inherent advantage over the other.
But my overall issue is that most bosses were either too mobile, too inconsistent, too hyper-aggressive, or not punishable enough to the point combat became a slog for me, or when these issues didn't arise, the bosses dealt hyper damage to make it a war of attrition.
If Last Protag truly decided not to increase their stats so that they could judge these bosses purely off their movesets, then surely this must have been done under the assumption that bosses in these games are supposed to play fair. But are they? If you have a decent amount of experience with these games, you know that the bosses, with very rare exception, have never been intended to operate on the same rules as the player. They don't run out of stamina, many of them seemingly have infinite poise, and they can— I mean, do I have to explain this? They can do shit like this! Admittedly, I'm just cherry-picking arguments here for the sake of making a point. I don't hold any ill will against these people or anyone who agrees with them. They're more than welcome to play these games with whatever self-imposed challenge they want, and if you harass them on my behalf, you suck shit. But I point these criticisms out because I think this goes a little deeper than having played in these ways, purely because they wished to experience the game in the most unblemished way possible, and therefore judge it on a more objective basis. I think it exemplifies an unusual tendency among fans to not want to meet the game on its own terms, or in some cases, even flat out refusing to engage with the mechanics. One of my favorite examples of this was something new they added to Elden Ring when it came out that feels like it flew under the radar of just about every returning fan. You can jump! Everyone knows this mechanic exists, of course, and generally most players will utilize it for jumping attacks, but were you aware of the sheer number of how many attacks in this game can be jumped over far more easily than they can be rolled through? One of the most powerful abilities in the entirety of Elden Ring isn't even something you have to be given by an NPC, find somewhere in the open world, or receive for defeating a boss. It's something you can do before you even walk out of the spawn room, but if you play every one of these games like it's Dark Souls instead of a game that's not called Dark Souls, then after a while of playing, you might have just forgotten it was even an option.
Dark Souls 1 isn't hard, it's just unique, and it punishes people who don't try to learn its unique mechanics.
For many, being someone who can say they've beaten all of From Software's games can feel like a badge of honor or a rite of passage. But if there's something even more honorable, something even more impressive, it's being able to say you did it all by yourself. You didn't use any ranged abilities while keeping your opponents at a distance, you didn't buff your weapon for extra power, you might have not even worn armor, and you definitely didn't summon any spirit ashes or players to help you kill any of the bosses. Doing these things would make your experience with the game inherently lesser because you didn't truly learn anything, right? So ignore the temptation of these shiny toys they keep trying to give you. It's all just a cheap trick to get you to enjoy the game less. Just keep at the old slash and roll until you can't even see characters on a screen anymore. Just the raw code that stands between you and victory. And then, after hours of dying over and over and just doing the same thing, look forward to waking up and doing it again tomorrow. Because that's what the developers intended. Right?
Light looks more beautiful in darkness. When there's something beautiful in the middle of a wasteland, we are able to appreciate it more. One jewel doesn't look like much when you have a pile of them, but if you find one jewel in the midst of mud, it is worth so much more. Personally, a world that is happy and bright is something that just doesn't sound realistic to me. It may sound like I have trauma or something, but I believe that the world is generally a wasteland that is not kind to us.
Before I had even started writing this video, I looked up some footage of Midra, one of the new DLC bosses, and I noticed something kinda strange. This video had so many dislikes. The ratio was almost split right down the middle. I was confused about this at first. This video by Gamer's Little Playground was exactly what it was described to be. It was just the raw footage of a player fighting and defeating this boss. And then it dawned on me. It's because the way that they accomplished this feat was by using a great shield in one hand, a spear in the other, and they summoned the Mimic Tier, which may as well have just been an actual war crime. Clearly, this type of sentiment when directed at others comes from a small, if just very vocal section of the fanbase, and we should all point and laugh at them. But the thing is, even if you don't make extremely embarrassing posts about this, or outwardly shame people for using these tools, the influence this culture had on how people choose to approach these games even now is obvious.
So is Dragon Breath considered cheap to use?
Am I bad for summoning people? I feel like I'm cheating.
I might be victorious, yet I still feel like a weakling.
Nobody talks about any other video games the same way they talk about these. Nobody starts their first playthrough of Resident Evil by immediately stashing away the shotgun, and nobody will tell you that not doing this will make the experience too unsatisfying. Something was clearly internalized in the minds and hearts of Souls fans. There's something about Elden Ring and its predecessors that you've probably heard already, but I'm gonna rehash it so that I can say it in my special little video essay way, and it's that these games truly are only as difficult as you want them to be. You can turn these games into a pure test of gut reaction and reflex, brute forcing every encounter by effectively playing it like it's a boss rush or a Twitch shooter, or you can slow down, rethink your approach, and play some fucking Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Memories. Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Memories was one of the first video games I ever owned for the PlayStation, my first console. As a pretty young kid, I was never able to make much progress in this game, firstly because I didn't own a memory card for a weirdly long amount of time, but secondly because Forbidden Memories happens to be another game infamous to this day for being extremely hard. The game starts off simple enough. You have your cards attack the ones in front of them, you hit your opponent's life points, and you win. But once you've defeated the first few introductory duelists, the game begins pitting you against ones that simply all have cards with bigger numbers than yours. And this can get pretty excessive near the end of the game, with later duelists being able to turn one summon a monster with fucking 3,500 attack. Man, fuck this game. How can you possibly compete in a game that's quite literally all about having higher numbers than the other guy? Well, this is where your knowledge of the game comes into play, because the difficulty of Forbidden Memories is fueled squarely by something I like to refer to as knowledge checks. Another term it seems I accidentally stole from the fighting game community. You see, Forbidden Memories has an entire system of creating more powerful monster cards than the ones you can normally obtain by fusing the ones you have in your hand. You won't find a list anywhere in the game of which monsters fuse together to make what, not even for the ones that you've already successfully fused. You'll simply have to memorize them. And sometimes it can get really arbitrary, like needing to fuse a card made of rock with a card that is a woman, despite nothing but the card art and your best judgment ever indicating whether a card is a woman or not. And yes, this exact combination makes one of the best early game fusions that there is. Knowing all the ways you can combine cards and knowing where to get those cards you need turns Forbidden Memories into a fairly easy, if just time-consuming experience. Once you know how to consistently fuse for Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon and you know which opponents drop good equip cards most consistently, you've more or less got your path to victory laid out for you all the way to the end of the game. That may sound boring on paper, but the experience of learning those things was awesome. I picked it back up earlier this year, and after enough practice and hours of referencing fusion guides on GameFAQs, I now know basically enough from memory to speedrun it. This is objectively a form of mastery over something, and the design that facilitates it is immensely satisfying to me in a way that feels just as rewarding as something like operating off pure focus and just parrying a boss to death. And the thing about FromSoft's games, especially Elden Ring, is that with the exception of Sekiro, I guess, these games have always been designed with this in mind. They are RPGs, a genre that was literally invented all the way back with tabletop RPGs to allow its players the freedom to create their own experience and confront obstacles in whichever way they choose. If you've encountered something that feels insurmountable, you can continue exploring the game's world and come back 6 D&D sessions later with a way to kick that thing's ass. Similar to the process of uncovering Elden Ring's plot by collecting hundreds of disparate pieces of lore through item descriptions and dialogue, eventually forming a clearer picture through which you can combat the fog surrounding the story, the method of combating the game's, well, combat is also a process of collecting and piecing together as many resources as you can possibly find. You can, at any moment and more frequently than ever before, try out a new weapon, equip a new weapon ability, change which stats most of those weapons scale from, reallocate all your stats if you want, maybe even try out a completely new playstyle. Or a very old one. Not to give Gamers Little Playground too much fucking credit here, but the reason they were able to easily beat Midra was because they knew where to find all the right equipment and they knew that this was the right time to use it. To me, it doesn't really matter whether they looked up what to do here or just figured it out by themselves. They beat Midra in a relatively short time and with 11 healing flasks left over because they passed the knowledge check. The beauty of Elden Ring, and I think its greatest individual accomplishment, maybe even the reason it successfully introduced millions of newcomers to these games, is that with enough patience, you can play and succeed at any point on the gradient between these two methods of approach as stubbornly or inventively as you'd like. An incredibly impressive feat when you consider that every encounter had to be designed to account for both. Sometimes, though, there are moments when not even the plus 10 Mimic tier or your strongest Comet Azure Blast can save you. Sometimes there is simply no easy win strategy for a boss, and you just keep dying, and dying, and dying, and you've just had enough.
I have endured more than enough.
I had a personal experience where a car suddenly stopped on a hillside after some heavy snow and started to slip. The car following me also got stuck, and then the one behind it spontaneously bumped into it and started pushing it up the hill. That's it. That's how everyone could get home. Then it was my turn, and everyone started pushing my car up the hill, and I managed to get home safely. But I couldn't stop the car to say thanks to the people who gave me a shove. I'd have just got stuck again if I'd stopped. On the way back home, I wondered whether the last person in line had made it home, and thought that I would probably never meet the people who had helped me. I thought that maybe if we'd met in another place, we'd become friends. Or maybe we'd just fight. You could probably call it a connection of mutual assistance between transient people. Oddly, that incident will probably linger in my heart for a long time. Simply because it's fleeting, I think it stays with you a lot longer.
After beating everything in Elden Ring's DLC, I did something I've never ever done before. Something that, until starting this video actually, had never occurred to me as something I might enjoy doing. I put down my own summon sign, and I spent countless hours being summoned into other players' games to help them. And it was some of the most fun I've ever had in a video game. During my initial playthrough, there were countless times I made use of messages from other players, or even just laughed at the particularly silly ones, and when a boss felt like too much of a hassle to defeat without forcing myself to simply endure it for hours, there were always other players there to back me up. Taking the leap and finally paying it forward and helping others defeat some of the bosses that I had trouble with filled my heart with a warmth unlike anything else. As it turns out, this is the element to these games that has always made them so special to me, but I had never really stopped to consider. There's nothing I look forward to more than the opening weeks of a new FromSoft game, because the feeling of being surrounded by people who are all holding out a helping hand to one another through messages, summons, picking apart the fucking lore, man, or yes, even sharing which builds or approaches make the bosses into a complete cakewalk. There's nothing like it, and if you're watching this right now, you probably agree. I'm glad that at least the marketing of these games has shifted to a more optimistic and victorious tone over the years. It feels like it's come a long way in affecting the outlook of the people who play them too. Nowadays, you'll hear more and more encouragement to ignore the nonsense and just have fun. And to be honest, I needed to be dissuaded from that line of thinking just as much as anyone else.
ただ戦に勝つ。その一時を市場とする権よ。
When I made my Bloodborne video a couple years back, many people asked me why I barely talked about the gameplay itself. And the honest answer is that these games have always had so much more to offer to me than just a challenge. The difficulty is undeniably a fundamental pillar of why these experiences work, but it's never been about the difficulty. Despite how desolate and hostile the world may seem, the real lasting thing that I walk away from every FromSoftware game feeling is that I won't ever have to face it alone.